Fyodor Dostoevsky, 1821 to 1881, one of Russia's greatest writers. He wrote Crime and Punishment, The Brothers Karamazov, and so on. Today's short story, The Wedding, is about the destruction of innocence through greed and cunning. I'm Kim Dodsworth, Queensland storyteller. Exactly 5 years ago, on New Year's Eve, I was invited to a children's ball by a man high up in the business world. He had his connections, his circle of acquaintances, and his intrigues. So it seemed as though the children's ball was merely a pretext for the parents to come together and discuss matters of interest to themselves, quite innocently and casually. There was a guest at the ball who interested me. He was a personage. They called him Julian Mastakovich. At first glance, one could tell he was an honoured guest. The host and hostess said no end of amiable things to him, were most attentive, whining him, hovering over him, bringing guests up to be introduced, but never leading him to anyone else. I noticed tears glisten in our host's eyes when Julian Mastakovich remarked that he had really spent such a pleasant evening. So, after amusing myself with the children, 5 of whom, remarkably well-fed young persons, were our hosts, I went into a little sitting room, entirely unoccupied, and seated myself at the end that was a conservatory and took up half the room. The children were charming. One of them was a particularly handsome little lad, dark-eyed, curly-haired, who stubbornly persisted in aiming at me with his wooden gun. But the child that attracted the greatest attention was his sister, a girl of about 11, lovely as a cupid. She was quiet and thoughtful, with large, full, dreamy eyes. The children had somehow offended her, and she left them and walked into the same room that I had withdrawn into. There she seated herself with her doll in a corner. Her father is an immensely wealthy businessman, the guests informed each other in tones of awe. 300,000 roubles set aside for her dowry already. As I turned to look at the group from which I heard this news item issuing, my glance met Julian Mastakovich's. He stood listening to the insipid chatter in an attitude of concentrated attention, with his hands behind his back and his head inclined to one side. Another child, a tiny chap of 10, thin, red-haired, freckled, now joined the little maid of the many-rubled dowry. He was the governess's child. She was a poor widow, and her little boy was clad in a sorry-looking little nankeen jacket. She let him sit down beside her, and the two set themselves busily to dressing her expensive doll. Almost half an hour passed, and I was nearly dozing off, as I sat there in the conservatory, half listening to the chatter of the red-haired boy and the dowered beauty, when Julian Mastakovich entered suddenly. He had slipped out of the drawing-room under cover of a noisy scene among the children. From my secluded corner, it had not escaped my notice that a few minutes before he had been eagerly conversing with the rich girl's father, to whom he had only just been introduced. He stood still for a while, reflecting and mumbling to himself, as if counting something on his fingers. 300, 311... 12, 13, 16, in 5 years. Let's say 4%. 5 times 12, 60, and on these 60, let us assume that in 5 years it will amount to, 400. But the shrewd old fox isn't likely to be satisfied with 4%. He gets 8 or even 10 perhaps. Let's suppose 500. 500,000 at least, that's sure. Anything above that for pocket money. He blew his nose and was about to leave the room when he spied the girl and stood still. I, behind the plants, escaped his notice. He seemed to me to be quivering with excitement. It must have been his calculations that upset him so. He rubbed his hands and danced from place to place, and kept getting more and more excited. Finally, however, he conquered his emotions and came to a standstill. He cast a determined look at the future bride, and wanted to move toward her, but glanced about first. Then, as if with a guilty conscience, he stepped over to the child on tiptoe, smiling, and bent down and kissed her head. His coming was so unexpected that she uttered a shriek of alarm. "If I come to visit your parents, will you love me, my dear?" He tried to kiss the sweet little creature again, but the red-haired boy saw that she was on the verge of tears, and he caught her hand and sobbed out loud in sympathy. That enraged the man. "Go away, go away, go back to the other room, to your playmates." "I don't want him to, I don't want him to. You go away," cried the girl. "Let him alone, let him alone." She was almost weeping. There was a sound of footsteps in the doorway. Julian Mastakovich started and straightened up his respectable body. The red-haired boy was even more alarmed. He let go the girl's hand, sidled along the wall, and escaped through the drawing-room into the dining-room. Not to attract attention, Julian Mastakovich also made for the dining-room. He was red as a lobster. The sight of himself in a mirror seemed to embarrass him. Presumably he was annoyed at his own ardour and impatience. Without due respect to his importance and dignity, his calculations had lured and pricked him to the greedy eagerness of a boy who makes straight for his object, though this was not as yet an object. It would only be so in 5 years' time. I followed the worthy man into the dining-room, where I witnessed a remarkable play. Julian Mastakovich, all flushed with vexation, venom in his look, began to threaten the red-haired boy. The red-haired boy retreated farther and farther until there was no place left for him to retreat to, and he didn't know where to turn in his fright. "Get out of here! What are you doing here? Get out, I say, you good-for-nothing! Stealing fruit, are you? Oh, so, stealing fruit! Get out, you freckle-face! Go to your likes!" The frightened child, as a last desperate resort, crawled quickly under the table. His persecutor, completely infuriated, pulled out his large linen handkerchief and used it as a lash to drive the boy out of his position. Here I must remark that Julian Mastakovich was a somewhat corpulent man, heavy, well-fed, puffy-cheeked, with a paunch and ankles as round as nuts. He perspired and puffed and panted. So strong was his dislike, or was it jealousy, of the child, that he actually began to carry on like a madman. I laughed heartily. Julian Mastakovich turned. He was utterly confused, and for a moment, apparently, quite oblivious of his immense importance. At that moment, our host appeared in the doorway opposite. The boy crawled out from under the table and wiped his knees and elbows. Julian Mastakovich hastened to carry his handkerchief, which he had been dangling by the corner, to his nose. Not long ago I passed by a church. I was struck by the concourse of people gathered there to witness a wedding. It was a dreary day. A drizzling rain was beginning to come down. I made my way through the throng into the church. The bridegroom was a round, well-fed, pot-bellied little man, very much dressed up. He ran and fussed about and gave orders and arranged things. Finally, word was passed that the bride was coming. I pushed through the crowd, and I beheld a marvellous beauty whose first spring was scarcely commencing. But the beauty was pale and sad. She looked distracted. It seemed to me even that her eyes were red from recent weeping. The classic severity of every line of her face imparted a peculiar significance and solemnity to her beauty. But through that severity and solemnity, through the sadness, shone the innocence of a child. There was something inexpressively naive, unsettled and young in her features, which, without words, seemed to plead for mercy. They said she was just 16 years old. I looked at the bridegroom carefully. Suddenly, I recognized Julian Mastakovich, whom I had not seen in all those 5 years. Then I looked at the bride again. Good God! I made my way as quickly as I could out of the church. I heard gossiping in the crowd about the bride's wealth, about her dowry of 500,000 roubles, and so much for pocket money. Then his calculations were correct, I thought. as I pressed out into the street. That was The Wedding by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I'm your reader, Kim Dodsworth, Queensland storyteller. I hope you'll join me again this time next week for another great short story.